hundreds of thousands of citizens of the country left to the streets to protest and to protect democracy. The President of Israel and the Justice Minister warned that this reform, so to speak, would rip the country apart. It is dangerous and may lead us to disaster. And then October 7 occurred. An establishment of an emergency administration, violation of agreements, and just a month ago, the Gali Barav Minara declared that democracy is fragile, and that even today there is a secret attack, an attempt to reinstate this secret reform. What is a secret reform? This is a panel for the advanced learner, because it's really difficult to talk about after what we heard later, but this is a subversive reform. It's still happening underground. It's still happening secretly. Now, some of the reasons have to do with the previous panel. We wake up in the morning and we're afraid to look at our phones and see that another name of a fallen soldier. 8 months we are exposed to this discourse of war and hostages and fallen soldiers, and you can't pay attention to anything else. You can't even, you don't even have the emotional strength to deal with it and deal with anything besides the war. So the fact that this is a subversive reform and a secret one is mostly because we're not paying attention. We're all focused on the war. And the second reason is that it's a secret, and because this is what Riv Levin wanted to do on the 4th of January, it's being done differently. It's not done through legislation. It's done under the table, behind closed doors, slowly, quietly, gradually, but it's still happening, this judicial reform, making our democracy even more fragile than ever. And let's give you the most obvious answer and example. We heard about this in the news today. Yariv Levin, as Minister of Justice, wanted to replace the members of the Judge Appointment Committee. They wanted different people on the Judge Selection Committee. And I said, obviously, he doesn't want anybody who's conservative or liberal. He wants coalition judges, meaning judges that are one of ours, so to speak. That's something very different. It's not a question of a judge of this kind of judicial mentality or that kind of mentality. He wants political judges, but he couldn't do it through legislation. So what does he do? He changed the decision-making protocol in the committee without changing a single word of legislation. He said, wait a second, I'm a chair of this committee. I determine the agenda. If you don't agree with the candidate that I bring forth, I'm going to take this paper that the agenda is written on, and I'm going to hold on to it so that we don't vote on anything. So they changed the rule. If there's no consensus, then we can't choose judges. Not for the magistrate court, not for the district court. You can't even talk about the Supreme Court. And now Yariv Levin doesn't have the majority. The majority now can elect any kind of judge, and certainly the president of the Supreme Court and the judges on the Supreme Court. But this is all stopped. They changed the rules. They're not doing any kind of committee deliberations, and they don't come to any agreements unless they're consensus agreement. And he did all of this without one word of legislation amendments. And this is now something. Now, Amos Gilad in the previous session talked about the appointment of head of the ISA, director of the ISA. Let's talk about appointments. There is an obsession now of our ministers about appointments. Look at the people being appointed. I won't appoint it. I won't even talk about the police force. It's too difficult to talk about. It's too painful. But the idea is that if you can appoint, or you can get rid of previous appointment, instead of appointing somebody neutral, professional, expert with experience, you just get someone loyal, and then that organization ceases to function. So you have the Judge Selection Committee, you have appointments, you have Gali Barav Miara, who is the general advocate, and if you want appointees, personal appointees, and you're doing that. You can see it every day. For months now, we can see that she is saying to the government, what you are trying to do is illegal. And what the government is saying is, yeah, we heard you. They're ignoring the Attorney General. And then she says, but if they say that it's illegal, I won't be able to defend it in court. And I said, don't worry, you don't have to defend it in court. We will bring our own person to defend it in court. This is file after file, case after case. We see this again and again, one and more in the gospel. We see with the enlistment law now. And the question is what to do now. And the judge selection committee again with its appointment. And day after day after day, more examples of this. And even in the midst of war. So that's the judicial reform, so to speak. It's still happening. It's still occurring. It's underground. And we are not dealing with it. We're ignoring it. And maybe we're not strong enough to deal with this day by day, this increasing, eating away and erosion of democracy.
Since the outbreak of the war, it seems that it's all becoming more and more complicated and difficult on the international sphere with the ICC and ICJ. So the question remains, how does the regime overall, how is that related to the procedures in The Hague? What are the implications or ramifications of these procedures, and how can Israel, or how could Israel have dealt with all this mess? I think that the answer is quite similar to what the previous speakers answered a different question. Israel was a very strong country with international status, perhaps one of the best reputations or status in the world. Legally, we were the #1 exporter of the judiciary field. Everybody quoted our adjudication, and our adjudication on the war on terror, it was quoted everywhere. There was tremendous pride in the Israeli judiciary system, but they've been trying to harm it for 18 months, to turn it, to make sure that it's not independent. We don't have a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and these things are being heard in the war. And on top of that, they wanted to pass the probability clause. What does it mean to revoke the probability clause? That the court will not be able to intervene in government decisions that are related to matters of war, of warfare as well. And that amendment, the probability amendment, had passed, and the state of Israel operated for 6 months, and there wasn't any possibility to review what the government was doing, what the ministers were doing under the probability clause. And then it was revoked in the most important ruling of the Supreme Court. And everybody knows all of that. And in addition to that, what's been discussed earlier, what's happening in Judea and Samaria, that's an indication for the world. Are we treating violations of the law according to international law? And then the war came along, and all that is already on the table. So now they started asking, but what are you doing about human rights violations? What about laws of warfare violations? Is there a commission of inquiry examining the allegations against violations of international law? Of course there is no such commission. We could have appointed that on October 8th. Let me remind you, Johnny, that we examined, that we reviewed the flotilla, that, and a commission of inquiry was appointed for that, but no commission of inquiry has been appointed for what's been happening for 8 months now. And these things have an impact, so they're very heavy-duty cases, and don't you think lightly of it. One in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which is writing its expert opinion on what's happening in Judea and Samaria, but is also addressing the allegation of South Africa that what we're doing culminates to genocide. Even saying that about Israel, that's quite inconceivable. And the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor has asked to issue warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Gallant. And the meaning of these warrants is not only that they could arrest Netanyahu and Gallant, it's not just something personal that pertains to them, it's ours, because it places Israel alongside a series of ostracized countries, not democratic countries, and it affects what we do overseas. I guess the University of Tel Aviv knows very well what's happening in the academia. All the participation in conferences has been canceled, and if these warrants will be issued, it will grow even worse. And there's an arms embargo. I think it's been 6 weeks since the prosecutor had requested the warrants, but the court has not convened yet. They gave us some grace, some time. Maybe we'll do something in the meanwhile. And I'm wondering, I'm asking myself, what is the state of Israel doing? Which commission was appointed? Did anybody say anything? No, they continue to speak in the exact same language to threaten with a settling in Gaza as if this weren't yet another violation of the rules of warfare. So we're just waiting for it to come without anybody doing anything about it. And actually, it should be a great source of concern for us, even if it's just 2 warrants against 2 individuals. Britain, by the way, said that the next government, if it is appointed, if the warrants will be issued, of course, it will uphold them. So that's the problem. And these are far-reaching implications. Let's take a deep breath. That was still relatively easy. And before we finish, maybe anything optimistic? Is there anything optimistic to say? Yes. I think there is, and I really liked the answer given by Major General Tibon. My optimism lies with the Israeli society, those people, those communities that we didn't even know about them, and all of a sudden we started seeing them after the judiciary overhaul. They're not, one thing, but they are come up from different groups, and they kept protesting week after week all over the country, and all they had was a flag and maybe a sticker, because they came out to protect this amorphous thing. They didn't even know what it was. Democracy, the judge appointment committee, absolute power against dictatorship. And it's the same people, it's the same Israeli population who were discovered on October 8th, and they filled the void left by the Israeli government. And I think that what David Grossman said in his formative speech this week, that we have for whom to fight. And we have what to fight for. There's nothing more optimistic than that, and it also applies to the legal issue as well. Thank you very much.